breathtaking discoveries in understanding the history and culture of Darjeeling Hills and Duar's Terai through the prism of the language and literature. Language and literature of a particular place holds the key to understanding the historical and cultural aspects of the place. An intense perusal of the literary heritage of Darjeeling Hills will give us an idea of the rich culture and heritage which Darjeeling Hills holds. Darjeeling Hills has been a center for literary activities from 19th century. Books, journals, and newspapers were published in languages such as English, Nepali, Tibetan, and Hindi. English journals and newspapers began to appear from 1892. Many literary works in Hindi and Tibetan too found their way to the press from 1879 to 1898. The most famous English publications during this period were Darjeeling News and Notes, Darjeeling Standard, Darjeeling Times, Darjeeling Kalimpong, Sikkim News, and Himalayan Times. The entry of Ganga Prasad Pradhan into the arena of literary activities gave a new impetus to Nepali literature. He established his own press and undertook the translation of Bible and began Gurkha Kabar Kagaj in 1901. He also published a series of stories for children. The decade began in 1930, witnessed the entry of some famous Nepali periodicals such as Nebula, Adarsha, and Koji. Gurkha periodical published by Gurkha League became well known for its analytical and critical essays. It provided much needed platform for many Nepali writers to groom themselves as future literary figures. The period between 1949 to 1958 could be considered as the golden years of Nepali journals in India. Pukar, Bharati, Sati, Hamro Katha, Chiksha were the journals which maintained a high quality in literary standard through their engagement in the literary field. Considering the vast literary heritage of Darjeeling Hills, the above narrative is only the tip of an iceberg. Dr. Swatahsiddha Sarkar, being an expert in the field, will enlighten us further on the topic, and I wholeheartedly welcome him to the seminar. Thank you.
Dr. Sarkar. He is a professor and director for Center for Himalayan Studies, North Bengal University. And today he will be sharing with us the idea and opinion on language and literature was as a perspective in understanding the Darjeeling Hills. Now I request Dr. Sarkar to help us understand more about the topic and throw some light into it.
So yeah, thank you friends for giving me this opportunity to discuss a little bit on an issue which is of my own interest. However, I have not written on this that much. So first of all, let me thank the Salesian College for, and also the mastermind who was behind this whole idea, that there should be a series of lectures on the broad perspectives on the culture and society of Darjeeling and the Terai Duars part of Himalaya. So it's on that particular series that I have been invited to talk on something which appears to be relevant or which fit with the larger theme that Salesian College has included in. So it is in that respect I have thought of considering the language and literature issue as such. Essential and very necessary as well. I don't know how and what will come out of all these exercises, but why not let us begin the journey. So it's in that way I said, yes, I can make some intervention. And I have thought of the title that you have already seen, to talk in relation to the question of language and literature. And I made it a kind of a perspective, arguing that language and literature can be viewed as a perspective, and which actually gives us a clue to understand Darjeeling's society and history, society, and politics. I would not say in a best way, but in a better way. Right. So this is what practically I want to do in today's lecture, which I must make two disclaimers at the initial phase, that I neither belong to the discipline called literature. I mean the area in which literature falls and language falls within. I no way is connected with them. I practice sociology as also social history to an extent. And it is out of that experience, I think I will try to make an intervention into the field of language and literature, and try to build up or develop a kind of a lens to look at the societal issues, which are societal actually, right? So this is what I claim, that the dynamics of society is probably better understood through language and literature. And in fact, by looking at the evolution, origin and evolution of language and literature, I hope that everybody could connect with it, that I am having all the time in my mind the question of Nepali language actually. So it is in relation to the origin and evolution of language and literature in case of Darjeeling. I think that is what that could help us understand the dynamics of the society, hill society, in a better way. And this is what is also being reflected in the history and culture of the space, as also the history of language and literature, the way it developed in the space, right? So it is in that sense I try to frame language and literature as a perspective, which I think is multidisciplinary. And by virtue of being multidisciplinary, it opens up the possibilities of intervention of a person like me, who is neither belonging to language nor literature, right? So this multidisciplinary vantage point helps us frame the temporality and spatiality of Darjeeling vis-a-vis the temporality and spatiality of language and literature at the same time, right? What I argue, that ruminations on the past, present, and even a future on Darjeeling is possible if we use this lens, or if we use this lens which is at our disposal now. So what I will try to do is not something that has been done for the first time by me alone. I mean, the question of language and literature in case of Darjeeling's history, society, and politics has been historicized by very many scholars, right? Like say the literary figures like I.B. Rai, Jivan Namdung, cultural critics like say Prem Poddar, anthropologists like say Mark Turin, Chelesa Booth, or Roderick Chalmers, political scientists like Rajendra Dhakal, or what the lady's name, he was a teacher in government college, I'm just forgetting her name, Alina Pradhan, yeah, Alina Pradhan, and philosophers like Dr. Tharadil of Salesian College, who has already published 2 books relating to this theme actually, and historians, the now famous, the late historian Kumar Pradhan. All of them has talked about language, literature, and their historicization in relation to the Darjeeling's past or Darjeeling's society and polity. My point is that then what I am going to do, please, Manisha, please the next slide. What I am going to do then on a topic which has already been elaborately discussed and defended upon by very many scholars, and some of whom I have named, and there are pretty others as well, right? So as I put already, I actually want to do something, a kind of an exercise, which you will see right at the moment. So in order to develop language as a perspective, I have certain conceptual assumptions, theoretical premises, and even certain hypotheses as well, right? So let me deal with that and how they are linked with the idea of the history and culture of Darjeeling. That is what I am trying to come in. So I start with an assumption, and the assumption is that I do consider that both language and consciousness, they're like same. They are the product of the society, or in other words, they can be considered as social product, right? So what I'm trying to say that there is a kind of mutual presupposition in my this entire discussion that both language and consciousness, they share a common theme, as in that they evolve out of the society, right? I hypothesize that language, like consciousness, it originates from the way we live our life as a social being, right? So what I mean by this is that language is not something that comes from without. Language, in more or less like the way consciousness is being understood, it originates in the way we live our life as a social being. And also wish to appropriate from two major propositions which are being, where Marx says that ideas do not exist separately from language. I repeat, ideas do not exist separately. Separability between language and ideas, what we think and what we express, get enmeshed with each other. Similar is another significant argument that Marx developed, and this is pretty well known. This says that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. This is there in German ideology, right? So these are the two particular comments that in fact gives the theoretical premise of what I am actually trying to do. So that means what I'm trying to argue, that it is not language that gives birth to our consciousness, but rather, if you allow me, I would say it's just the other way around. The way we get ourselves feeling that we are conscious, and in that process, the urgency of having a language comes in. How, why we are coming to these points in the later course of today's discussion. Banisha, please, next. So that is how I developed the argument and for this present occasion. So I mean to say that linguistic and literary domain is as dynamic as the domain called as social, right? So language and literary domain is also and is actually, and it can be viewed as a dynamic platform, like the way we do consider society, or in a adjectival sense, the social. So another point that I want to make, that language, the way we think of it generally, that it is the conglomeration of speech, words, and all these things, and as if language is constituted of all of them. I would argue that these things, while thinking about language through the light of speech or words, they are not necessarily to be thought of that these are the end in themselves. So the speech that we use, or the words that we use, that in fact constitutes the idea of language to us, is not an end in themselves, by which what I mean is that communication is therefore not the ultimate goal of language. It's simply the only one function of language, right? So the way we communicate through language is to be treated as only one function, not the totality of language is not related with communication alone, right? By which what I again mean that words therefore can serve as the catalyst of many historical acts. And I want to digress a little bit. If you look back to the way the history has evolved in Darjeeling context, this particular thing, the words, how it can act as the catalyst, or how it can ignite the cause of movement even. Say, for example, during the late 1970s, the example one can draw from Morarji Desai and his speech against Nepali language and the repercussion of it. And even in the 2017, the last Antim Larai, the way it has been put, the more than 3 months strike that had happened in 2017 from June onwards. And the story began with the very issue of the hegemonic presence of Bengali as a language. Are you getting what I'm trying to say? So it's in that sense I am saying that words in that way, therefore it is not related with communication alone, right? So words can in fact ignite the popular sentiments and even can ignite masses against the ruling hegemony as well, right? So let us move back to the point that we were dealing with. So that means interaction, therefore, is to be premised as the basis of language. And in fact, I do consider it like that. So I view language more in the light of the way interactions take place. And this interaction does not merely mean the verbal interaction. This interaction is a larger thing, by which what I mean, the social interaction in which or through which we live our life, right? So language is in that sense arises out of the need and necessity of the social interaction. So the point is, the way you feel about having a particular language, in the way you live your life, and in the way you interact with each other, in the way you maintain your social relationships, that actually gives birth to the need of having a particular kind of a language. I hope those who are familiar with the historicity of Darjeeling a little bit, they can make the sense out that what I'm trying to say, that it is definitely gives us a clue to understand that how language, I mean Nepali language, did evolve and how it was found to be necessary. And this necessity, if you ponder over it, you will find that this necessity was actually based on the need of how to maintain social interaction, right? And this social interaction is not about verbal communication alone. This social interaction involves social relations as also production relations, the issues with which we will deal a little late. So language is in that way appears to be essentially a social phenomena. I don't know whether among the listeners there were any linguists or persons belonging to linguistics or not. They will really not be cool with this proposition, what I am proposing now, by saying that language is essentially therefore to be viewed as a social phenomena. Let us continue with it. Please, Manisha, down some more points actually. So the production of ideas, of conceptions, of consciousness is directly interwoven with our social and material life. That is what I actually wanted to mean by social interaction, right? So social interaction is not simply about verbal communication. Social interaction is related with the way we produce ideas, we conceptualize things, and that actually builds up our consciousness of being a self, right? And all these are interwoven with the way we are placed in a social and material domain of life, right? So it is in that way language therefore evolves like a kind of a real life situation. Language gets a platform in the real life situation actually. So the production of ideas, conceptions, and consciousness, which are related with the way we place ourselves in the material living, we get the language as meaningful in the real life situation. These considerations lead us further to argue that linguistic usage bears the imprint, therefore, of class relations and ideologies, and that the power of the ruling class extends to the usage of language. So that means language is not simply a kind of expression that we use it through the use of air, through our throat and all. It's simply not like that. What I'm trying to argue, that language therefore appears to bear the imprint of class relations and ideologies, and that the power of the ruling class extends to the usage of language. All these can be clearly explained with the examples at the time of discussion. If it comes, I will do that. Otherwise, it will go on extended with one particular point actually. So the thesis out of all this saying, all these positions that I am trying to make, is that language is a social and ideological phenomenon, right? And when we argue that language is a social and ideological phenomena, this actually would help us understand what I have termed as historicization of language in the Darjeeling Hills context, or the way the question of Darjeeling's, the language and literature issue has been historicized. I have referred to other scholars. They have actually done this, but although not by following this framework, but we can understand their framework through this slide, that how language therefore emerges as a social and ideological phenomenon. Let us proceed with the next one. So language as a social and ideological phenomena, how it has to be thought of and constituted of in order to understand the Darjeeling situation, right? So the need is to give primacy to language's social character and social communication, besides examining the role of the ruling ideas, nay, the ruling class. What I'm trying to say that we now need to give primacy to the social character of language, and this social character, as I already placed it, is to be thought of in the light of the ideas that it produced, in the light of conceptions that it held, or in the way that it held in the social communication also. And this also has to be looked into in the light of how ruling ideas or the ruling class, that how they found certain favorable role to play in this entire process, whereby one particular language appears to be significant compared to the others. I mean to say that if we consider the 20th century or late 19th century events in Darjeeling, one can talk of there were many languages, but how all of a sudden Nepali appears to be the significant one, and ultimately it is Nepali that in fact becomes synonymous with the idea of the hill identity, right? What I'm trying to say that this is not simply to be understood only in terms of considering language as a social character or its ability to deal with or to enable us for continuing the social communication, but also that how ruling class is also attaching its own interest. It is in that sense language becomes very close to the idea of political economy, right? So how Nepali language becomes helpful for the rise and propagation of colonial interest in Darjeeling Hills, that was also very significant in order to define or in order to determine that which language is to proceed further within the Darjeeling context, right? So that's what, and that's how it becomes both social as also ideological at the same time. So this approach further helps us explain the emergence of language and linguistic identity, and extends even to explain the issues of language endangerment and minority linguistic cleavages. This is the point that I will come at the end of the discussion. So this frame not only will help us understand how linguistic identity got consolidated, as also the fragmentation of linguistic identity, if any, if it has happened in the long run of Darjeeling history, or in other way, the way things are now being put, that there is a kind of the obliteration of minority languages going on. That's what is called as language endangerment, or the minority linguistic issues which are coming up. So that can also be looked into, that how much what we can actually get out of all these new developments which are coming up, right? So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the question of inclusion leading towards solidarity, or for example the question of exclusion leading towards the rupture of that solidarity, is the position that we can gain out of looking at language through this a kind of a materialistic interpretation that I have tried to follow, right? So please, so this inclusion leading towards solidarity is actually the case with what has happened in Darjeeling, right? And exclusion leading towards ruptured solidarity may be treated with the case of Bhutan, for example, where Nepali language has been excluded, and how that has become a kind of an impact, that made an impact in the way Nepali identity also being fragmented in the country called Bhutan, right? So let us proceed with the further part. So language as a social and ideological phenomena, here again dealing with the earlier positions that I have made, I would like to continue with the argument and relating with certain practical experiences of Darjeeling situation. I do find that there is a synonymity between Nepali language and Nepali identity politics. I hope those who are present over here, they probably agree with me that the synonymity between Nepali language and Nepali identity politics is basically grounded in what I am trying to articulate in the materialistic form of interpretation that I have followed so far, right? So the how Nepali identity politics therefore becomes synonymous with language. Now here you could see that language therefore not merely remains an issue of communication alone, right? So it becomes a very significant and a very potent force in order to augment politics, in order to augment the self-realization, in order to conceptualize one's being placed in a certain particular place, in a certain particular manner, right? So that's how we can't even understand that how this happens if we do not have the earlier positions that I have made already. So the question therefore comes up then how these particular thing, that this mutuality between language and identity that had happened, how they mutually reinforced each other, and how in these processes, how they produced and reproduced the narratives and counter narratives of linguistic right questions out of these all processes, right? So these are the questions that comes up as very significant, and in fact they are significant to my mind actually. I don't know how we were going to see them. So illuminating all these issues, in order to do that, I think we need to have a careful probing towards the deep structures of the relationship between language, history, culture, community identity on the one hand, and power, ideology, and economy on the other, right? So that's how the interface, the material interface that takes place. So you can understand this only when it had been, you are agreeing or you are trying to relate it with the questions of language, history, culture, and community identity, and pitting it against, or I would not say against, pitting it parallelly with the way power, ideology, and economy evolved over the years. Hence, the problematic of Nepali language and politics in Darjeeling Hills, therefore, it becomes centered on, and it had been centered on, the various forms of domination and subordination worked out in the way language issue was pitted against the broader fields of culture, economy, and politics of the region, right? So language vis-a-vis identity, vis-a-vis the way culture, economy, and politics evolved in the region, you can't actually separate them, right? All go hand in glove, and that's how the powerful vantage point that comes out of linguistic identity movement, right? So let us proceed further. Language as a social and ideological phenomena in a similar manner, therefore, it gives us the sense that language in this manner surpasses its nature and form. I mean that I began with the very proposition that language is not simply a means for communication, right? So it is here you could see that how language actually surpasses its nature and form. From being a mere means of communication, it acquires the qualification of having a pattern of meanings. If not, it is to be viewed as a product of ideology, right? So the pattern of meaning that it derives and that it teaches are all worked out through the ideological formation that has happened historically over the years in Darjeeling. Therefore, analyzing language as an ideological one, as ideological actually, is not having a reference to language per se. When I say language ideology or language is to be viewed as an ideological formation, I mean I don't have language as a reference point, right? What I am having as a reference point is that I want to argue that the need is to examine how such ideologies envision and enact links of language to the social location of the speaker caught up in the web of social relationship. That's where the location of the ideology is there, and that's how language makes an entry into that domain and becomes ideological, right? So how people are being socially located, how the speakers are being caught up in the web of social relations, that actually defines the ideological embeddedness of language, right?
organized and run through disparate bodies of social institutions. The way we are being placed, we are there to run our social existence through the disparate bodies of social institutions like caste, religion, schooling, nation state, and even the production arrangement or production relations, actually, right? So that means the location of ideology is all around these spaces, and out of the interface between language and these locations, the multiple locations, that we get the ideologically founded vision of language, actually, right? So this is what I am attempting to suggest, and I am actually trying to do. So let us proceed. It is in this way of looking at that how we are socially being placed in the very many wave of social networks besides the social institutions, that I find that there is a position that we can take. That these are the two positions that I have framed. I call it as language of command and language of contestation. So the pattern of meaning embedded in language as something ideological, as I put it already, that is sometimes indicative of a tendency to unify a variety of languages or dialects into a single language group, and begins to play an authoritative role over and above the different groups, those followed dialects of their own. This is precisely the history of language in Darjeeling. I mean, the way Nepali as a language, the way it evolved as a language, I call it as language of command. I am having no prejudice while saying this. By language of command, I therefore mean that it is about a single language, not of multiple languages, and these multiple languages actually submitted to one single language, which, as I already put in the previous slides, that was actually the need, the social need, right? That how to interact with each other and how to maintain the social relationship at different levels of our social placement was not possible if we have multiple languages at our disposal, right? So that was the social contingency, and besides that, there was a colonial, the political interest. That's what is called as the ideas of the ruling class, that they have tacitly approved also that yes, Nepali is the language that should evolve and that should come up. And as you all know, probably, I don't know whether how much of you are aware of those facts. I will not be tracing on those things because there are plenty writings on those facts, that how Nepali language evolved, in which year, how Nepali language has been used in the schools and all other stuff. So these all come into this, whatever I have put it, making Nepali language as a frame of language of command, where, as we all know, that Nepali language falls within the Indo-Aryan school, language school, while the languages which has contributed towards the formation of Nepali language were all belonging to the Tibeto-Burman school, right? So that means the Tibeto-Burman language is converted into and unified into one, and thereby created the language of command. Language of command in the sense that it was the language through which not only the social relations, but also even the political relations, administrative relations, in the way colonial governmentality grew up in Darjeeling, were maintained. And there is again another possibility that at times the already unified meaning of authoritative language, the language of command, fall prey to the discrete minority languages in a mode of constructing a fertile ground for contestation. That is actually the case that has happened in eastern Nepal, particularly, and all of Nepal nowadays, you can call it, where minority languages were being reproduced as the mode of a new thinking, thereby discrediting Nepali as being the language of command, right? So the language of contestation is also a very much Himalayan thing. However, some sort of implications of this, I think, is pretty visible in the region where we are all placed, Darjeeling, actually. So viewing language through the ideological frame or as an ideological product ultimately gives birth to the two domains that I call as language of command and language of contestation. So the language of command and contestation as I already put it, and please carry on with the next slide. Now let us deal with the second part of today's discussion, that is with literature, right? So I have taken some strong positions, and I don't know how many of you are belonging to literature. Actually, they may find quite, they may find my propositions quite weird, maybe. Anyway, I have no problem with that. So let me begin with. So I have taken a position saying that there is nothing spontaneous in literature. If we have this in mind, I would say that let us see that how it is not. So if there is nothing spontaneous in literature, that means I am having the same framework in my mind. That means I am trying also to show literature as an ideological product, actually, right? So the authenticity of literature, as it is very common to those who deal with literature, and even to those who do not deal with literature, that the way we perceive of literature, actually. So the authenticity of literature is to make us see, perceive, and feel something which alludes to reality, right? So it is literature that actually enables us of these doings, right? So if we take, for example, along with this particular position, that how it helps us see, perceive, and feel something which alludes to reality, that can be reflected with this example. If I say that if we take the case of the novel, say, Brahmer by Rupnarayan Sinha, or the short story Pahar Rakhola by I.B. Rai, or for that matter, the collection of poems Kinara Ko Awaz Haru by Remika Thapa and our beloved Manoprasad Subba, or say Dahine Bato by Gyanendra Vaksho. These are the books that I am having with me. Anyway, so Gyanendra Vaksho, as also the one that is being called as Orko Laskar by Raja Punyani. I mean to say that they make us see all these instances, for example, they make us see, perceive, and feel something which alludes to reality, right? What it means by this is that if you see that the examples that I have chosen, they are all reflective of a particular genre of Nepali literature, right? If I go by one, you could find it out that my selection of Dahine Bato or Orko Laskar or Kinara Ko Awaz Haru, or for that matter I.B. Rai or even Brahmer, Rupnarayan Sinha, they all represent a particular genre of Nepali literature. Am I making sense? That's what actually I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say that it's not spontaneous the way we may feel like that literature is something spontaneous. Each of these cases are reflective of certain ideas, embedded in certain ideas, and they're actually preaching certain ideas, right? As I refer to the earlier point, that the ideas and language, they can't be separated. Gundry's Karl Marx, right? So if it is the case of preaching ideas, propagating ideas, and being embedded in ideas, so how come that it all of a sudden becomes spontaneous, right? Because the ideas are to be germinated out of the social, right? So the ideas do not come from without. I hope that you could also make the sense out that I made it a point that how consciousness and language go simultaneously on the premise of social, right? So that gets already reflected in these positions that I make. Please, what literature makes us to see, as I said already, that seeing, perceiving, and feeling, and therefore gives to us in the form of seeing, perceiving, and feeling, is the ideology, actually, from which it is born, in which it takes its birth, and from which it detaches itself, and which ultimately it alludes to as well, right? So that's what is literature, the way I see it. So when I speak of ideology with reference to literature, I mean that ideology slides into human existence itself. I have already pointed it out that how ideology is to be located in the way we live our life. Let us come to that point once again. That is why the form in which we are made to see ideology in novels, short stories, or poems has its content, has as its contents the lived experiences. I hope that you could get the clue. So that means what literature is reflecting on is broadly being viewed as lived experiences of individuals. My point is, this domain of lived experiences is thoroughly ideological. It is ideologically embedded, right? So that's how the novel, the short stories, the poems that we read, or through which we try to see, perceive, or even feel the pangs or the pleasures of the social reality, is basically having as its content the lived experiences, right? So the connect between lived experiences and its representation in the literary domain is made possible through the domain of ideology, actually, right? So that's the point that I am trying to make. Please proceed. Seeing literature as ideological, I have certain other points also to share, that the lived experience is not something given. What we see as lived experience, and since the lived experience is not something given, I mean to say that given by a pure reality, right? So the lived experience is not something given by a pure reality, but the spontaneous lived experience of ideology. What you see as lived experience is basically the spontaneously expressed lived experience of ideology, which lies in its inseparable relationship to what we consider as real, right? So the link between real and ideological, right, is in that way very close knit. So the more spontaneous, I mean, if a literary piece is appearing to be, I would say that the more spontaneous a literary product appears to be is the one that maintains this subtlety of the interface between the real and ideological in more fine-tuned manner than others. The more you say the literature is spontaneous, I would say that this spontaneity is basically the ideological spontaneity, and more fine-tuned way it is being represented, that is why it appears to be very spontaneous, probably, right? So this comment actually help us and lead us to link language and literature issues in the context of Darjeeling, that we have already pointed out in the previous section of the discussion, right? So the link between real and ideological, right? That means the way life is lived and the way life is reflected upon. Please proceed. Right. So that is what is being done, and we have to understand this actually. So the lived experience that we were talking about, that is getting reflected in literature, and experience is not something to be given by a pure reality, but it appears to be the spontaneously lived experience of our everyday life, which is what we consider in relation to the real, right? So I hope this is a little bit, I would not say problematic, a little bit esoteric it may appear to be, but it's very, very simple. The way we live our life and the way we reflect on our life, right? The connect between both these two is, I am making a point that is ideological, right? So you are getting influenced by the way you live and you feel or you see the life is being lived, right? And that is what is getting reflected in the literature that you produce. And this is the real and the ideological. I argue that this helps us to come to a particular position, and I think with this I am coming to the end part. That is what I try to do, both in order to view the evolution of Nepali language and literature. I argued that both language as also literature are ideological. While language is viewed as a result of ideological emanations, literature is, on the other hand, embedded into it and reflects on it rather spontaneously, right? So while language can be viewed as a result of ideological emanations, literature actually is embedded in the ideology and it reflects on it rather spontaneously. There is, therefore, a congruence between the way life is lived and the way life is reflected upon. I hope that you could make the sense out that when I say the way life is lived is the domain out of which language has evolved, right? and the way life is reflected upon is the domain where literature comes in. And I argue that there is a congruence between both these two, and this congruence is impossible to understand if you are not having a materialistic disposition at your disposal, right? So this is to be understood in the light of considering both language and literature as ideological. This as a perspective can actually help us take a position on the phenomena of language of contestation. The point that I made already earlier actually, and I said that I will come to this as the end, right? So how life is lived and the way life is reflected upon can lead us towards the phenomena of language, towards understanding the phenomena of language of contestation. And if you allow me, I would say it can even lead us towards taking a position on this. By this, what I am having in my mind is actually, I have written this also, that this implies, or what I am implying by this is that the growing politicization of linguistic cleavage that is going on in Darjeeling actually right at the moment, and the predominance of the micro-community identities, which are also premised on the question of minority language claims. Say, for example, Gurung is talking about Gurung Kura, that it has to be revived and language, I mean, the script has to be developed and all other things. In a similar way, it is the case with the Rais, it is the case with Tamangs, it is the case with all other communities. That's why micro-community identities that I have already pointed it out, right? So what I mean that this is also coming up as a kind of an emerging reality, which is also giving birth to or having some similarity with the idea of language of contestation. And in certain cases, what I am worried about that in certain cases, there are certain scholarship which are also growing up, I'm sorry to say from within the hills, that they feel and they try to show that yes, this language of contestation is basically what is necessary, because there is a kind of a Nepali hegemony that is at work, and against which, or in tandem with that, the minority languages, or rather this community languages, has to be revived, right? So my point is that had it been the case in the sense that this language of contestation, had it been a reality in true sense of the term, that would have got reflected in the literature. Am I making sense? I mean, in the Nepali literature actually. The latest genre of Nepali literature is being represented by these two, I hope you could see this, these two particular books, or they are also belonging to two different genres, right? One is called as Samavesi, the other one is called as Hastaskepi, right? So even these two latest genres are also not reflecting on the need of having community identities replacing the Nepali identity actually, right? So I intentionally end up with this provocative statement saying that had it been the case, this would have got surely reflected in the literature, because we have already seen and tried to make it a position that literature and language both comes up with the congruence between the way life is lived and the way life is reflected upon, right? So I don't see any possibility or any fear of or any danger of that Nepali identity is going to be tarnished in the coming years, because there are, I mean, Nepali identity, when I say it, I am saying this in the term of in the way of saying that it is founded on Nepali language actually. So the demand of minority languages is not going to disqualify the historic image of Nepali language and Nepali identity, the way it evolved in Darjeeling. And I hope that I probably made the journey that I started with, saying that Nepali language, I mean the language and literature can actually in fact help us not only to understand the past, present, but even to make some musings over the future of Darjeeling as well, right? I think I should stop, otherwise I would go on continuing and continuing. With this, I just give us a little example that this language of contestation, I already pointed it out that this had become a major theme in Nepal, right? By which what I mean is that if you see Nepali literature, the field of Nepali literature in Nepal, you will find the significant presence of the Janjati language and Janjati literature actually, right? That is not still, or that is not yet the case in Darjeeling. Still, wherever I am having, I don't have right at the moment at my hand the books. I am having some books in my library where I have books like that. Mogurs are propagating the need of Mogur language, but the book is written in Nepali, right? I hope that you can make the sense of that what I'm trying to say. So we need Mogur language to be revived, but the pamphlet, but the way the things are being propagated, that is written in Nepali. So a Mogur needs a Mogur language, but that has to be propagated in Nepali. So that shows, that means the question of language of contestation is probably not the situation over here, because the way language evolved in Darjeeling was altogether different from the way it evolved in Nepal, right? And that's the point that I wanted to end up with.
Another question from Brendra Bhujel.
Okay.
He says, language as an ideology, how
Yeah.
the people of Darjeeling, Tarai and Duars had gone for the process of ideological shifting from ethnic dialect into the Nepali language in its historical phase, and how the present revivalism of ethnic identity, including ethnic dialect, has been impacting the community identity of the Nepali. Shall I
Yeah,
repeat?
no, I got it. In fact, this is the point that I made already. At the end, I think Birendra might not be there, or probably he was there, I don't know. So that's the point that I made. The way the urgency of having one language that emerged in Darjeeling, I mean the Nepali language. I am not that familiar with Terai and Duars, so I will not comment on that part. But if you extend the same argument, and if you view the same reality there in Duars and Terai, so I think my proposition goes with the same cases as well. So what I'm trying to argue, that the urgency of having one single language in case of Darjeeling, in its historicity, we could see that it was a kind of a demand, or a kind of an aspiration that was felt by the people, right? And that these people, to make it a very clear point, that these people were having their different languages, right? They are rather dialects. They thought and they felt it necessary, because they wanted to be into a domain, into a web of social relations, and these relations, social relations, surpassed their social living as well, right? So this was the context out of which, in if I'm not mistaken, during the last 2 decades, these issues are coming up with the new, I mean, the languages which already submitted their position in order to develop Nepali as the single language. The other languages, they are also coming up, arguing that now the minority languages are needed to be revived, and the minority languages are to be developed. I am not at all against the idea of language endangerment, right? But what I am trying to say and trying to argue, that safeguarding the minority language is in that way not going to tarnish the image of Nepali language and Nepali linguistic identity as such, right? Because the entire historical trajectory gives us enough clue to understand that this is not at all the case. I mean to say that what happened in Nepal is actually not happened in Darjeeling. For example, to put it in a different way, in Nepal, Nepali language appeared more as a Rashtriya Bhasha. You just see the qualifiers. In Darjeeling, Nepali is being viewed as a Jatiya Bhasha, right? So the difference between Jatiya Bhasha and Rashtriya Bhasha, I hope it can be meaningful to anyone, whoever is present over here. So when you put Rashtriya Bhasha, Nepali as a Rashtriya Bhasha, so you have all the way to exercise the governmental machinery, and that has actually been happened in case of Nepal, and particularly in the entire eastern Nepal. That is how Nepali has been propagated over the years. So by forcefully submerging the minority languages and establishing the hegemony, I use the word hegemony, of Nepali as such. But when you just cross the border and come into Darjeeling, we don't have the historical proof, right? We don't have the historical proof that says that Nepali has been, how to put it, a forceful application upon the people of Darjeeling that they should consider Nepali as the one language, right? So my point is that it was people's aspiration, not that it was an imposition from above. It was a kind of a realization from below that has given birth to Nepali language as also Nepali linguistic identity and politics thereafter, right? So now the same questions of minority language and little languages which are nowhere right now at the moment, this is also not grounded in that social history. That's the point that I'm making. So if you are making this as a claim, I would say that this claim is rested on the political and other instrumental interests, but not the social interest that could relate with any existing historical proof or a sort of a kind of a historical amnesia, if you to put it in that manner, right? So the way I would rather again put it, I have myself has worked on this, and also some of my scholars have worked on this, putting straight away questions to those minority linguistic groups that how much they are familiar with their own language. In most of the cases, it appeared that those who are propagating the need of having the community language, they do not know themselves the language itself, right? They always have a reference point that others do know it, seniors do know it, and the person belonging to that particular area, they do know it. But I am not knowing it right at the moment, but I am trying my best to go for it, right? What comes up as a probable explanation to me is that this cropping up of these minority languages, I see them more as having a symbolic value than a kind of a political value as such, right? Symbolic value in the sense that, yeah, it's always good to talk about one's own culture and preservation of one's own identity. It's in that way, it's valid. But that doesn't mean that I am going to sacrifice Nepali. That doesn't mean that I am going to send my words to get, educated in the minority languages, right? So we have a ready example with Sikkim as well. In Sikkim, if I'm not mistaken, there are at least 7 or 8 languages which had been given the chance in the Sikkim University to have a PG degree even, right? Like Limbu, Gurung, and all other languages, the minority languages. And they find an acute problem in both the respects, having the faculty who could teach, and also after having passed, what to do with that, right? So what I'm trying to say, that language, unless it is having a linkage with the political economy, is probably not going to have a space in terms of, if we are to think in terms of its existence or non-existence.
The question that was given by Sangam Ghatani, he says that, sir, you have written a lot about the socio-political scenario of the hills. I wanted to know, how have you perceived the construction of Nepali language as a lingua franca and the marginalization of other languages of other ethnic groups present within the diverse Gorkha community in shaping of the hill politics, particularly in the wake of what we frame as ethnic revivalism?
Right. So on this, I would say that my observation on this point, that how Nepali language emerged and how and whether I do consider it as a kind of how to put it, denial to the all other languages, I think I don't subscribe to this position, as I have already pointed it out, that the imposition, it was not a case of imposition the way it was a case in Nepal. It was a kind of an aspiration from below. So that makes a real difference. And that also, there are, I think, several such anecdotes through which it can be proved and it can be showed. And I hope that you all know Balkrishna Sharma, who once said that what Nepal thinks today, what Darjeeling thinks today, Nepal thinks tomorrow, right? It was not the essentialist Bahunist position, actually. I'm sorry. It was a position of the advantage of Darjeeling in terms of being a modern space that actually heralded the equations relating to the language issue as also the question of Asmita, identity, right? And linking it up with the diasporic cause of nationalism that grew well in Darjeeling. That was not the case in Nepal, right? So this is one anecdote out of which I could say that it was not a kind of a strict imposition per se, but yeah, it was the case that the other minority languages, they have given, I would say they have submitted, and in fact it is the question of ideology. So the ideological framework and ideological necessity was such that they have done this in the past. And if you say, as in what is happening, ethnic revivalism, and if you find that this ethnic revivalism is having an ideological place, right? Still today, as I have pointed it out, still today it is not like that, at least to my observation. That ethnic revivalism is not having or did not receive the strong foothold in Darjeeling so that it could get reflected. Had it been the case, it would have surely been reflected in literature. I have shown all the major dimensions of Nepali literature, even the most latest ones as well. They are also not talking about the Janjati aspiration and giving it a space, saying that Nepali language hegemony is to be discarded off and this Janjati languages are to be replaced back to their earlier position. They are also not taking this position. What again I am trying to say that this is a particular position, as I already referred to, that there is a finest scholar in Nepal, he is a historian, I hope many of you might be knowing his name, Pratyay Sonta, who has written extensively on this, and he has reviewed more than 100 Janjati journals and covered up the Janjati, what the contents the Janjati journals are having. And his analysis shows that the literary content that the Janjati journals in the context of Nepal that they are having and what they are propagating is, to his view, is a kind of counter public sphere, right? He is developing that argument. He has developed actually that argument. So there is the emergence of counter public sphere that has happened through Janjati literature, right? I don't see that kind of a possibility over here. I have seen some of the Janjati magazines, this ethnic community magazines, where nowhere there is a question of this literary formation that is taking place. Rather, only the provocative arguments that we should have our own language, this kind of stuffs are going on, right? At least till the moment. So I don't see that there is a kind of very strongly founded Janjati aspiration could get a breakthrough through the linguistic mode, the way it has happened historically with the case of Nepali language and Nepali identity politics. So that's pointing out that how language and literature can also become a vehicle of creating political rupture in an already unified, consolidated ethnic identity or ethnic group known by the name of Nepali or Gorkha as such. And I do see all the possibilities are there. And as you have rightly pointed out, I didn't make this as a point whenever I was arguing. And I fully approve this. Yeah, I do see that this is a ploy that is going on. And interestingly and significantly, the people who are talking about these small identities, micro identities, they are responding to this political high-handedness that is very much visible. That is very much visible in this way of encouragement of minority identities and community identities that is being done by the state, right? And this had been there throughout Darjeeling's history, that a kind of a contentious relationship between the state and the political structure of Darjeeling Hills. However, while in the earlier cases, during the Ghising Jamana and all others, during that time, the confrontation was pretty clear. And nowadays, the same confrontation is going on, but in a very subtle manner, where these positions are being propagated under the rubric of development, welfare, and you name it and you have it. The issues like that, the things are going on which actually aimed at creating a rupture in the collective cultural fabric, right way you have pointed it out, sir. Yeah, I do see this is the simplest and probably the surest way of the misgivings that Darjeeling probably can expect if the processes are going on like this. But still, on this one position that I could share, that was of late Professor Kumar Pradhan. He was still he also commented on this. I think many of his writings are reflecting on these ideas, and he was, at least he made a very significant comment saying that as long as Nepali as a lingua franca stands in Darjeeling, Sikkim, and in this entire region, market, as long as Nepali stands as a lingua franca, probably there is no danger of this cultural rift. But soon Nepali language loses its qualification of being the lingua franca, the danger is in. So at least I think this is also a very significant observation. This is not mine. This is the observation by Professor Kumar Pradhan, late Kumar Pradhan. And I think this also partly reflect on what you have also pointed out. So I think we still are not in a position to make out any final statement that what it is going to lead to, but probably we should be very careful on this. Practically, people from the Darjeeling Hills itself.
I request Father Dr. Our principal, Father Dr. George Tatatil, to give his kind words and observation.
Thank you, sir. My first observation, first of all, compliments to you and all the work that you have done over these past years in promoting, or rather in studying yourself out of your own personal interest. It would be nice to know what exactly brought you to specialization in this region and on these topics. I would have expected, or I thought, your presentation deserved, in fact, to be broken into two parts. The whole discussion with regard to linguistic identity on the one side and everything else that you spoke about in terms of the evolution of the Darjeeling, Nepali identity and its kind of evolution, emergence, consolidation, and the kind of contemporary evolution or anxiety that it is going through. Now, let me, my dear students and other colleagues who are on the panel, first of all say that a word of congratulations to the department for having thought of this topic and for having got none other than the Sarkar, who is an expert on the field, to discuss this issue. Because I think nothing like, connecting theory, ideology, concepts that you're learning from the textbook with the possibility of linking it in a location. And that's the advantage, in a way, of talking about Darjeeling and being in Darjeeling that we all have. And Darjeeling is not only a tea brand, not only ideal, beautiful, natural location, an internationally known place, but it is also a people. And most of all, it is a people. And how these people arrived, how these people constituted, not only when we say in Darjeeling, in the literal Darjeeling, but as Sir alluded to the entire, let's say, the Indian Nepali speaking diaspora that is spread across the sub-Himalayan region, into Burma, into Bhutan, into Sikkim, and this entire belt. So this identity is something that, as a historian, and you as history students, or as a sociologist, or as a political scientist, one has an opportunity to observe closely. And we have persons like Swatahsiddha, who is studying to be, let's say, visited, their text to be visited, and to be compared and contrasted. So these are my first initial observations, and thanks and congrats to the department for having created this webinar.
Now coming to my own take on one of the issues that you mentioned. First of all, let me say one thing about literature and spontaneity. You see, we could look at literature from an ideological perspective, definitely, but how does literature come at all? How does literature originate? Think of a student who is writing a poem or writing a story for the first time. I just finished editing, going through the final edit of our college magazine. Every year we have Sparkle and we have SCS Speaks for the two campuses. And you find always new pieces of writing that is coming in. And what makes something to come up as a piece of poetry that we read and we get taken up? Here is something. Yes, as you said, we are being drawn into the life experience of that person, out of which that literary piece emerged. But we can't deny that there was creativity. And that spark of creativity, that spark of, the spontaneous, the Sanskrit word of is spoda, a kind of a bombardment of an idea that surfaces in the mind as a result of many things. Yes, I know you look at someone has, assimilated an entire discourse as a result of which a particular writing, and therefore it is ideological, or it is embedded in an ideology. But we can't deny the other aspect that makes literature precisely because it is a creative, spontaneous expression. That's my one observation. I have an issue with the other theoretical positioning that you have taken. Let's contrast. Now I'm coming now to what extent this Nepali as we are saying about Nepali as lingua franca, and the sub-ethnicities and the sub-linguistic emergence of, and you mentioned about the Magar guy writing in, talking about the need for Magar language to be promoted or to be brought back, or same thing could be applied to lecture or to Rai or to any of those concepts that are there. But then let us look at, just yesterday I watched a video by the anchor who is speaking in beautiful British accent English,
right,
of Beyond TV, talking about why English is dominating the vernaculars of India, and how the colonial experience has, in a way, created this situation in which we are all running after English, and we don't have sufficient knowledge of the vernacular. You see the parallel there? So we find no problem, or rather we on the one side see that dynamic happening, and when a similar thing is happening at a smaller level, we have problems. Here I find a difficulty in putting the two together. It is true we need vernacular, it is true we need English, because we are global citizens. And why should that possibility of being connected globally be restricted only to certain class and caste? And why not it for all? So this is again discourse kind of. And on the other side, we have same thing here. Okay, Nepali as a unifying language has definitely given rise to this identity in Darjeeling and for all entire Indian Nepali population. Should that be only seen? I'm not thereby denying the rightful point that you made, that there could always be agents who are trying to cause some kind of destruction. But how does the community, and this was our point of discussion the other day in Darjeeling Free Society Forum, and therefore I made this point, that yes, for various reasons, we need both. We need these communities, because at the end of the day, who are the Nepali speaking people? They are either a mother, or they are Rai or Kaman or Lecture. So these people came together, these communities came together. It is a community of communities. So this dynamic of a dominant, let's say a dominant language vis-a-vis vernacular, whether it is happening at the national sphere or it is happening at the regional sphere here, could we see or could we not see it, and this is my question to you, in a more, let's say, societal transformative manner, which kind of dynamics keep on happening, whether it is here, whether it is in Central Asia, whether it is in, let's say, in the Russian Federation that this member, vis-a-vis Russian and Crimea, etc., or anywhere, or in Latin America, anywhere we could take this kind of a conflict between a dominant language and the subjugated languages, playing this up and down game of who is superseding whom. Having made this point, and so also you made it as a reference to this Anup Sharma, here is where I have a little reservation. So, is it that somebody trying to control someone else is not okay in one location and it is okay in some other location? So, for what the British did to India is wrong, what Indians are doing to Indians themselves becomes all right, and what, let's say, Bengal does to Darjeeling is not okay. What Darjeeling itself dominant group does to the other sub-dominant group is not okay. See, I don't know if I made the point, and I would like to, probably we don't have the time to discuss. We could take it up even on another platform when we meet, or we could take it up. But I just wanted to bring these couple of points to the observation. And once again, thank you. It was a very nice presentation of you referring to the whole sociological and ideological component aspects of language, and language is not simply a means of communication, but there's a whole lot behind it. Thank you so much.
And thanks also for organizing this very thought-provoking lecture series, and I also hope that there would be other lectures that would go on the same theme by others. And my congratulations for your team and for taking this initiative up. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I ask Dept ma'am to give the vote of thanks.
On behalf of the Department of History, Salesian College Siliguri campus, I would like to thank Sir Dr. Swatahsiddha Sarkar, who took out his valuable time from his tight schedule. Thank you so much, sir. We are blessed to have you, Amit sir. Thank you so much, sir. Today's presentation, or rather we can say discussion, was really very informative and energetic. I would like to extend a heartfelt gratitude to our Reverend Father George Sadatil, an inspiration for all of us. Thank you so much, Father, for your immense support and your encouragement to us. I would also like to thank the Vice Principal of Arts and Humanities, Reverend Father George Champakadiyal, for his support. My special thanks to Father Ajukurian, Coordinator of IQAC, Sir Peter Lepcha, Dean of Arts and Humanities. I may not also be forgetting the technical assistance that we got from Sir Dept Subba. I am thankful to our respected Father Babu Joseph, who is being the backbone of our department. My words of appreciation to Ms. Manisha Pradhan. Ma'am, you have conducted the seminar very well. Congratulations. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the participants. Thank you for your support. Without you, our webinar would not have been successful. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Salesian College team, and thank you, Dr. Tharadil as well.